The courtroom was packed that morning, so full you could barely breathe without bumping elbows with someone. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes dancing in the air like tiny fireflies. Reporters sat in the front row, fingers flying over keyboards, while lawyers shuffled papers with the kind of nervous energy that comes before something big is about to happen. At the center of it all sat a judge, older, sharp-featured, with a voice that carried like a gavel crack. He'd built a reputation for being tough, efficient, and, if people were honest, a little too quick to judge folks based on how they looked or what job they held. On the docket that day was a case that had been splashed across headlines for weeks. A wealthy businessman accused of spreading lies that destroyed a rival company. The details were tangled: emails, secret meetings, whispers in boardrooms. But the heart of it was simple. Did he lie on purpose to crush the competition? The plaintiff's team had called dozens of witnesses, CEOs, analysts, even a former assistant, but none had delivered the smoking gun everyone was waiting for. Then, just before lunch break, the plaintiff's lawyer stood up again and said something that made the room go still. "Your Honor, we'd like to call Evelyn Carter to the stand." A ripple went through the crowd. "Who?" Some people leaned over to whisper. Others frowned, scanning the room. Near the back, a woman in a simple navy dress stood slowly. She wasn't flashy. No designer suit, no bold jewelry. Just a soft cardigan, sensible shoes, and silver threading through her dark hair like quiet wisdom. She walked with calm steps, eyes fixed ahead. Not on the judge, not on the cameras, just on the path in front of her. The judge glanced at her file, then looked up with a raised eyebrow. He didn't say anything out loud, but the way his lips curled just slightly said enough. To him, she was just another service worker, probably dragged in as a last resort. He gave a small sigh, as if this were a waste of his time, and muttered under his breath to his clerk, "What could a maid possibly know about corporate slander?" His voice was low, but not low enough. A few people nearby heard it. One lawyer winced. A reporter scribbled something fast. But Evelyn? She didn't react. She reached the witness stand, placed a hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, her voice clear, steady, and calm, like water over smooth stones. She'd worked in that billionaire's home for over 20 years. She'd seen birthdays, funerals, late-night arguments, quiet moments of kindness, and bursts of anger. She knew the rhythm of the house, the creak of the third stair, the way the coffee machine hissed at 6 a.m., the sound of the boss's voice when he thought no one was listening. And that was exactly why she was here. When the lawyer asked her why she'd come forward, she didn't hesitate. "I heard him," she said simply. "One evening he was in his study talking on the phone. He didn't know I was just outside folding laundry in the hall. He said, plain as day, that he'd made up the whole story about the other company. Said it was just business, but it wasn't true, and he knew it." The room went quiet. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. The judge shifted in his chair. He'd expected her to mumble, to backtrack, to say she wasn't sure. Instead, she spoke like someone who'd carried this truth for months and finally had a place to set it down. But instead of treating her words with the weight they deserved, the judge leaned back and gave a dry chuckle. "Mrs. Carter," he said, voice dripping with polite disbelief. "Are you certain you weren't just dusting the furniture and mishearing things? These are complex business matters, hardly the kind of conversation a housekeeper would understand." A few people in the gallery stiffened. One woman crossed her arms. A young law student in the back row looked down, shaking his head. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked at the judge, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet disappointment, like she'd seen this before, many times. "Your Honor," she said gently, "I may clean houses, but I've got ears and a memory. And that night I heard every word." For a second, the judge looked like he might say something sharp in return. His jaw tightened. But then he caught the eyes of the reporters, the lawyers, the people watching from the benches, and something in his expression flickered. Maybe it was doubt. Maybe it was the first crack in his certainty. He cleared his throat. "Fine," he said, waving a hand. "But let's not waste the court's time. Move along." He signaled for her to step down, already turning to the next item on his docket, as if her testimony had been nothing more than background noise. But just as Evelyn turned to leave the stand, the defense attorney, the one representing the billionaire, stood up quickly. "Your Honor, before she goes, Mrs. Carter brought something with her. Something we believe is relevant." The judge frowned. What is it? Evelyn paused. Then, from her worn handbag, the kind you'd use for groceries or church, she pulled out a small black device. A voice recorder. It looked ordinary. The kind you could buy at any electronics store for $20, but in that room it might as well have been a bomb. I found this on his desk the next morning, she explained. He must have left it on after the call. I didn't listen to it right away. I just put it in my drawer thinking I'd give it back later. But after I heard the news about the lawsuit, I played it, and I knew I couldn't stay quiet. The attorney asked the court's permission to play the recording. The judge hesitated, his earlier confidence now replaced by a wary stillness. But he nodded. As the recording started, the billionaire's voice filled the room. Clear, arrogant, unmistakable. Yeah, I fed those lies to the press myself, he said on the tape. Let him try to recover from that. Business is war, man. You either win, or you disappear. Silence crashed down like a wave. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. The billionaire, who'd been lounging with his arms crossed and a smirk on his face, went pale. His lawyers started whispering urgently, flipping through files like they'd missed something huge. Which they had. And the judge? He sat perfectly still. His earlier smirk was gone. His eyes were fixed on the recorder, then on Evelyn, then on his own hands. He didn't say a word. Not one. In that moment, the room understood something important. Truth doesn't care about your title, your job, or how much money you have. It only cares if you're willing to speak it and if others are willing to listen. And Evelyn? She just stood there quiet as ever, watching the powerful man who'd underestimated her, and the judge who'd mocked her, both realize in the same breath that they'd been wrong. Dead wrong. The case wasn't over yet, but something had already shifted. The air felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. And for the first time that day, the real story wasn't about money or power. It was about a woman who chose honesty over silence and changed everything with just a few words. And a tiny black recorder. After the recording ended, the courtroom didn't erupt in shouts or gasps like you might see in movies. Instead, it went so quiet you could hear someone's pen drop 3 rows back. That kind of silence, the heavy, stunned kind, meant everyone understood. Something serious had just happened. The billionaire, who moments before had been leaning back with his arms crossed like he owned the room, now sat stiffly, eyes darting between his lawyers like he was searching for an escape that didn't exist. His face had gone from confident to pale like someone had pulled the color right out of him. Evelyn didn't gloat. She didn't smile or nod in satisfaction. She just stood there, hands folded in front of her, calm as a Sunday morning. She'd known this moment would come the second she decided to keep that little recorder. It hadn't been about revenge or fame, it was about doing what felt right. She'd seen too many people stay quiet just because they thought no one would listen. She wasn't going to be one of them. The judge, who had been so quick to brush her off earlier, now looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. He cleared his throat twice before speaking, and when he did, his voice was flat, careful, nothing like the sharp, dismissive tone he'd used before. "Play it again," he said quietly. The attorney hit play once more. The billionaire's voice filled the room again, clear as day. "I fed those lies to the press myself. Business is war." There was no mistaking it. No way to argue it was taken out of context. It was a full confession, recorded in his own voice, in his own home. A few reporters started typing furiously. One woman near the front covered her mouth with her hand. Even the bailiff, who'd stood stone-faced all morning, shifted his weight like he was unsettled. Then the defense team tried to recover. One of the lawyers stood up fast. "Your Honor, this recording was obtained without consent. It's a violation of privacy. We moved to have it thrown out." But the plaintiff's attorney was ready. She didn't plant it. She didn't hack anything. It was left out in the open, in a common area of the home where she works. And under state law, if one party to a conversation records it, even accidentally, it's admissible. Especially when it's evidence of fraud. The judge didn't rule right away. He sat back, fingers steepled, eyes narrowed. You could almost see the gears turning in his head. He knew the law. He also knew the optics. Throwing out a confession like this after mocking the woman who brought it forward would look terrible. Worse than terrible, it would look dishonest. So after a long pause, he said, "The recording is admitted into evidence." That simple sentence changed everything. Now the billionaire was on the spot. The plaintiff's lawyer turned to him. "Sir, is that your voice on the recording?" He hesitated, glanced at his team, swallowed hard. I don't recall that conversation," he finally muttered. "But you just heard it." The lawyer pressed gently, clear as day. "Do you deny saying those words?" "I might have been joking," he said weakly. "Business talk. You know how it is. But nobody bought it. Not the judge. Not the jury. Not even his own lawyers looked convinced." Meanwhile, Evelyn had been asked to return to the stand. This time the judge didn't sigh or roll his eyes. He didn't make a single sarcastic comment. He just nodded slightly when she sat down, like he was trying to make up for how he'd treated her before. The lawyer asked her simple questions. When did she find the recorder? What made her keep it? Why did she wait to come forward? She answered each one plainly. "I kept it because something felt wrong. I didn't go to the papers or post it online. I waited until someone asked me to tell the truth under oath. That's what matters to me, not headlines but honesty." Her words landed softly but firmly. You could see people in the gallery nodding. A young woman in the back wiped her eyes quickly. An older man in a worn suit sat up straighter, like he'd just remembered something important about dignity. Then came the hardest question. Were you ever afraid to speak up? Knowing who this man is, his money, his power? Evelyn paused. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to get it right. "Yes," she said finally. "I was afraid. Not for myself so much, but for my job, for my family. People like me don't usually get a chance to be heard in places like this. But I kept thinking, if I stay quiet, then lies win. And I didn't raise my kids to let lies win." That hit hard. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine for a second. Outside the courtroom, news vans had started gathering. Word had spread fast. "Maid's recording sinks billionaire in court," one headline would later read. But inside it still felt personal, like you were watching something real, not staged for drama. The Billionaire's team tried damage control. They argued the comment was taken out of context. They said he was stressed. They even suggested Evelyn might have edited the file. But when the tech expert from the plaintiff's side confirmed the recording was untouched, original, unaltered, time-stamped, their arguments crumbled like dry bread. By late afternoon, the mood in the room had shifted completely. What started as a routine corporate case had turned into something deeper. A moment about who gets believed, who gets dismissed, and what happens when ordinary people stand up with extraordinary courage. Evelyn never raised her voice. She never pointed a finger. She just told what she saw, what she heard, and why it mattered. And in doing so, she reminded everyone in that room, especially the man in the judge's robe, that respect isn't earned by your title or your bank account. It's earned by your character. As the session adjourned for the day, people didn't rush out like they usually do. Many lingered, watching Evelyn gather her things. A few came up to thank her quietly. One older woman squeezed her hand and whispered, "You made us proud today." Evelyn just smiled softly and said, "I just did what anyone would do, if they weren't too scared." But everyone knew that wasn't true. Most people would have stayed silent. Most people would have tucked that recorder away and pretended they never heard a thing. But she didn't. And because of that, the truth had a fighting chance. Back at home that evening, she didn't watch the news coverage. She made dinner for her grandson, helped him with his homework, and sat on the porch listening to the crickets. The world might be talking about her, but her life hadn't changed, not really. She still woke up early. She still believed in hard work. She still trusted that doing the right thing mattered even when it was hard. And somewhere downtown in a quiet office, the judge sat alone long after court had closed. He stared at the transcript from the day's hearing. He read Evelyn's words over and over, and for the first time in years he wondered if he'd been wrong. Not just about this case, but about a lot of things. He didn't say it out loud. But deep down he knew. The woman he'd mocked had taught him a lesson he'd never forget. And in the silence that followed, he finally listened. The next morning, the courtroom felt different, not just because of the extra reporters or the buzz in the hallway, but because something had shifted in the air, like the ground had tilted slightly under everyone's feet. People walked in quieter, sat down slower, and looked at Evelyn not with pity or curiosity, but with something closer to respect. She arrived early, as always, wearing the same simple dress and cardigan, carrying her handbag like it held nothing more than a lunchbox and a library book. But everyone knew now what that bag had held, and what it had changed. The Billionaire's legal team came in looking exhausted. Their crisp suits were wrinkled, their ties loose, and their usual swagger was gone. They huddled in the corner, whispering fast, flipping through papers like they were searching for a lifeline that had already slipped away. Their client sat at the table, staring at his hands, no longer the untouchable tycoon from the business magazines. He looked small, human, and for the first time, maybe even scared. The judge entered last. He didn't stride in with his usual air of authority. He walked slowly, eyes down, and when he took his seat, he didn't bang the gavel right away. He just sat there for a few seconds, hands resting on the bench like he was gathering himself. When he finally looked up, his gaze landed on Evelyn, not with mockery, not with impatience, but with something new, caution, maybe even humility. The plaintiff's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to continue with cross-examination of the defendant." The judge nodded. "Proceed." What followed wasn't a dramatic showdown, it was something quieter but far more powerful. The lawyer didn't shout. He didn't wave papers or pace like a storm. He just asked questions one after another, calm and steady, like he was peeling an onion layer by layer. "Did you tell the press that your competitor was under federal investigation?" "Yes. But I heard it from a source. Was that source reliable? I believed it at the time. But the recording shows you admitted you made it up. Why the contradiction?" Each answer the billionaire gave only dug him deeper. He stumbled over words, changed his story twice. At one point he even said, "In business, sometimes you have to bend the truth to survive." That line hung in the air like smoke. Even his own lawyers winced. Evelyn watched from the witness gallery, not with anger, but with sadness. She'd cleaned his house for over 20 years. She'd seen him laugh with his kids, comfort his mother when she was sick, even cry once after a big loss. She knew he wasn't all bad, but that didn't make what he'd done okay. Then the lawyer turned to her again. "Mrs. Carter, you've worked in that home for decades. In all that time, did you ever see this man lie to someone's face?" She thought for a moment. "Not to family. Not to friends. But in business? Yes, more than once. He called it strategy. But I always knew the difference between strategy and dishonesty." Her words weren't loud, but they cut through the room like a clean knife. The judge didn't interrupt, didn't scoff, didn't even lean back in his chair. He sat forward slightly, elbows on the bench, listening like every word mattered, which for once it did. Outside, the world was reacting fast. News outlets were running segments titled, "The Maid Who Broke the Billionaire." Social media lit up with messages of support. Teachers, nurses, delivery drivers, janitors, all saying, "She spoke for all of us." But Evelyn didn't see any of it. She didn't have time. After court, she had to catch the bus home to pick up her grandson from school. Back inside, the defense tried one last move. Their lawyer stood and said, "Your Honor, we request a recess. We'd like to discuss a possible settlement." A murmur went through the room. A settlement meant they were giving up, admitting defeat. The judge looked at the plaintiff's side. They nodded. "Very well," he said. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour." During the break, Evelyn stepped outside for fresh air. She didn't go far, just to the courthouse steps where a few people recognized her and smiled. One woman handed her a bottle of water. "You're doing something important," she said softly. Evelyn thanked her and took a small sip, her hands steady despite everything. Inside, behind closed doors, the Billionaire's team was scrambling. They knew the case was lost. The recording was solid. The testimony was consistent. And now, with public opinion turning fast, dragging this out would only make things worse for his reputation, his company, maybe even his freedom if fraud charges followed. So they made an offer. Full financial restitution, a public apology, and a promise to donate to small businesses harmed by his actions. The plaintiff accepted. When court resumed, the judge read the terms aloud. The billionaire stood, pale but composed, and said, "I accept responsibility for my actions. I misled the public, harmed an honest business, and betrayed the trust of many. I'm truly sorry. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic, but it was real." Then the judge did something unexpected. He turned to Evelyn. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice low but clear, Before we adjourn, is there anything you'd like to say? The room went still again. She stood slowly, not for drama, not for attention, but because she felt it was right. I just want people to know, she began, that you don't need a fancy degree or a big office to know right from wrong. You don't need money to have integrity. Sometimes the truth comes from the quietest places, from the kitchen, the laundry room, the back hallway, and it deserves to be heard just the same. She paused, then added, I didn't come here to bring anyone down. I came here so the truth could stand up. No one clapped, courthouses don't work that way, but you could feel the shift. Like a door had opened somewhere deep inside the room, letting in light that had been blocked for too long. The judge nodded slowly. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. And for the first time, he said it like he truly meant it. As the gavel came down to close the case, Evelyn gathered her things without fanfare. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't pose for photos. She just walked out the same way she'd come in, quiet, steady, and sure of herself. Later that evening, sitting on her porch with a cup of tea, she thought about the day. Not about the billionaire, not about the headlines, but about her mother who used to say, Honey, truth don't need a spotlight. It just needs someone brave enough to carry it. She smiled too. Herself, she'd carried it, and the world had listened. The days after the courtroom, drama unfolded like pages turning in a story nobody expected. Evelyn went back to her routine, waking before sunrise, making a pot of strong coffee, folding the laundry, checking on her grandson's homework. But the world around her had changed in ways both big and small. Strangers smiled at her in the grocery store. The bus driver held the door a second longer when he saw her coming. Even the woman who ran the corner laundromat slipped an extra dryer sheet into her basket and whispered, You made us all stand a little taller. But Evelyn didn't let any of it go to her head. She knew this moment wouldn't last forever. Fame, even the quiet kind, was like morning fog. It burned off once the sun got high. What mattered was what you did while it lasted. Meanwhile, the billionaire's public apology began to ripple through the business world. His company's stock dipped, then stabilized as they announced reforms. An ethics review board, transparency pledges, and a fund to support small businesses hurt by false rumors. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And behind it all, people kept mentioning the woman who'd spoken up, the housekeeper whose honesty had forced a powerful man to face what he'd done. Then came the judge. He didn't call her. He didn't send a letter. Instead, he showed up one Saturday morning at the community center where Evelyn volunteered, helping kids with reading after school. He wore plain clothes, khakis and a button-down shirt, no robe, no gavel, no title pinned to his chest. He stood near the doorway for a while, watching her sit cross-legged on the floor, patiently sounding out words with a shy 8-year-old who struggled with because and enough. When the session ended and the kids filed out with backpacks and loud goodbyes, he stepped forward. Mrs. Carter, he said, voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She looked up, surprised but not startled. Your Honor, she replied, standing slowly. I'd like to speak with you, if you have a moment. She nodded and led him to a quiet bench under a big oak tree outside. No cameras, no audience. Just two people, the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. For a long time, he didn't say anything. He just stared at his hands like they held answers he couldn't find. Finally, he spoke. I was wrong, he said simply. Not just about the evidence. About you. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She let him find his words. I've been on the bench for 23 years, he continued. I thought I was fair. I thought I judged people by their actions, not their appearance. But that day, I saw your hands, your clothes, your job, and I decided you didn't belong in that courtroom as anything more than background noise. And that was my failure, not yours. His voice cracked just a little on the last word. Evelyn looked at him, not with pity, not with anger, but with the same quiet understanding she gave the kids who stumbled over their letters. We all make mistakes, she said gently. What matters is whether we learn from them. He nodded, eyes down. I've spent the last week reviewing old cases. Cases where I might have dismissed someone too quickly. A janitor who saw something, a delivery driver who heard a threat, a nanny who noticed bruises. I told myself I was being efficient, but maybe I was just being blind. She didn't offer empty comfort. She didn't say, oh, it's okay. Instead, she said, then do better now. That's all any of us can do. He looked up at her then, really looked at her, like he was seeing her for the first time, not as a maid, not as a witness, but as a person who carried wisdom in her silence and strength in her stillness. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked. "For reminding me that justice isn't just about laws. It's about listening, really listening." They sat in silence for a few more minutes. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty but full of things understood without being said. Later that week, the judge did something unusual. During a routine judicial ethics meeting, he shared his experience, not naming Evelyn, but describing the moment he'd let bias cloud his judgment. He didn't make excuses. He didn't hide behind "everyone does it." He simply said, "I failed to see a person because I was too busy seeing a stereotype. And because of that, I almost let the truth walk out the door." His honesty sparked a quiet conversation among other judges. Some admitted they'd done the same. Others promised to retrain their staff on implicit bias. It wasn't a revolution, just a ripple. But ripples can become waves. Back in her neighborhood, Evelyn kept doing what she always did. She helped Mrs. Lopez carry her groceries when her arthritis flared up. She stayed late at the community center to help a teenager fill out a college application. She even started a small reading circle for adults who'd never learned to read well, meeting every Thursday in the church basement with donated books and strong coffee. One afternoon, a local reporter asked if she'd consider writing a book or doing a speaking tour. She smiled and said, "My story isn't special. It's just honest. And there are millions of honest people out there, cleaning offices, driving buses, cooking meals, who never get a microphone. I was just lucky enough to be heard." But she did agree to one thing: helping start a scholarship. Not for lawyers or CEOs, but for young people from working-class families who wanted to study law, social work, or education, the kind of fields where listening matters more than titles. She used part of the modest reward she'd received from the plaintiff's side, not as a prize, but as a seed. "Plant it," she told the community center director, "and let it grow for someone else." The day the scholarship was announced, a group of high school students came to thank her. One young man, tall and nervous, said, "My mom cleans offices downtown. People act like she's invisible, but after what you did, I told her, you matter," and she cried. Evelyn reached out and squeezed his hand. "Tell her I said so too." As the weeks turned into months, life settled into a new rhythm. The news vans disappeared. The headlines faded, but something deeper remained. A quiet shift in how people saw each other. At the courthouse, clerks made sure every witness, no matter their job, was treated with respect. At city council meetings, more voices from service workers were invited to speak. Even the local paper started a monthly column called Voices from the Back Room, sharing stories from cooks, gardeners, security guards, people who'd always been there, but rarely heard. And Evelyn? She still woke up early, still folded laundry, still made tea in the same chipped mug. But now, when she walked down the street, people didn't just see a maid. They saw someone who'd stood in a room full of power and said, "The truth is here," and made them believe it. She never asked for thanks. She never wanted fame. All she'd ever wanted was for honesty to have a chance, and in the end, it did. And sometimes late at night, when the house was quiet and the stars were bright, she'd sit on her porch and think about how one small act, keeping a recorder, speaking up, showing up, could change more than just a courtroom. It could change hearts. It could change minds. It could remind everyone that dignity doesn't come from what you wear or what you earn. It comes from who you choose to be when no one's watching. And especially when everyone's life has a funny way of circling back. Just when you think a chapter is closed, it opens a new door, sometimes right where you least expect it. For Evelyn, that door came in the form of a plain white envelope slipped under her mailbox one rainy Tuesday afternoon. No return address, just her name written in neat, careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small key. The note read, "You saw what others ignored. Now I hope you'll see what I've tried to fix." At the bottom was an address, a quiet street on the edge of town near the old library. No name, no explanation. Just that key and those words. Curious but cautious, Evelyn waited until the weekend. She asked her neighbor to keep an eye on her grandson, put on her good coat, the one she wore to church, and took the bus across town. The address led to a small brick building with tall windows and a freshly painted sign, The listening room. She turned the key. The door opened with a soft click. Inside wasn't an office or a store. It was warm, quiet, and full of books. Shelves lined the walls, mismatched chairs sat in cozy clusters, and in the center of the room stood a small wooden desk with a nameplate that simply said, "For the Truth Tellers." On here. The desk lay a letter. This time it was signed. It was from the judge. He explained that after their talk under the oak tree, he couldn't stop thinking about how many people never get a real chance to be heard. Not in courtrooms, not in meetings, not even in their own neighborhoods. So he'd used part of his savings, along with a few quiet donations from others who'd been moved by what happened, to buy this space. Not for lawyers, not for politicians, but for everyday people, bus drivers, cooks, gardeners, students who had something important to say but no platform to say it. He'd named it the listening room because, as he wrote, listening is the first act of justice. And he'd left the key with Evelyn because, in his words, "You taught me that truth doesn't wear a suit. It wears work shoes, carries a lunch pail, and shows up even when it's scared." Evelyn stood there for a long time, running her fingers over the smooth wood of the desk. She didn't cry, but her eyes got that soft, faraway look they got when something touched her deep down, like when her grandson spelled his name right for the first time, or when her mother's old hymns played on the radio. She didn't take over the place. She didn't turn it into a stage for herself. Instead, she began opening it every Saturday morning, just like she did at the community center. At first, only a few people came, mostly folks from her church or neighbors who'd heard rumors. But word spread. A retired school janitor came in one week and shared how he'd quietly paid for school supplies for kids who couldn't afford them for over 10 years. A young woman who cleaned offices downtown talked about overhearing plans to lay off dozens of workers and how she'd warned her coworkers in time. An elderly man who drove a city bus for 40 years told stories about the people he'd helped. The runaway teen he took to a shelter, the lost child he stayed with until police came, the grieving widow he drove home every week for a year after her husband passed. No one interrupted. No one judged. They just listened. And Evelyn, she made tea. She passed out cookies someone had baked. She sat in the back sometimes just watching, reminding herself that courage doesn't always roar. It often whispers. Meanwhile, the judge kept his promise. He started a new practice in his courtroom. Before any witness testified, he'd look them in the eye and say, "Thank you for being here. Your voice matters in this room." It seemed small, but people noticed. Bailiffs stood straighter. Lawyers spoke more respectfully. Even defendants seemed to sit up a little taller, like they finally felt seen. One day, a young public defender pulled Evelyn aside after a community event. "I had a client last week, a dishwasher accused of theft," she said. The store owner assumed he did it just because of how he looked. "But I remembered what you said about truth coming from quiet places, so I dug deeper. Turned out the real thief was the night manager. We proved it. My client walked free." Evelyn just nodded. "That's how it starts," she said. "One person choosing to look closer." Back at the listening room, something beautiful began to grow. It wasn't just a place to speak. It became a place to connect. People started offering help after hearing each other's stories. A seamstress offered to mend clothes for a single dad who worked 2 jobs. A retired teacher began tutoring kids whose parents couldn't afford lessons. A local cafe started donating leftover pastries every Saturday morning. No one called it charity. They called it community. And through it all, Evelyn stayed grounded. She still took the bus. She still folded laundry. She still checked her grandson's math homework with a pencil and a patient smile. But now when she walked into a room, people didn't just see a housekeeper. They saw someone who'd helped rebuild trust, one honest word at a time. One evening, as she locked up the listening room, a teenager approached her, shy, hands in pockets, eyes down. "Miss," he said softly. "My mom, she cleans houses too. People talk over her like she's not there. But after what you did, I told her, you're important." And she hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. Evelyn smiled. "Then you did something even braver than I did. You stood up for her." He looked up then, eyes bright. "Can I volunteer here? I'm not much, but I can sweep floors or make coffee." "You're plenty," she said, handing him a spare key. "And floors don't sweep themselves." That night, as she rode the bus home, she watched the city lights blur past the window. She thought about how change doesn't always come with sirens and headlines. Sometimes it comes in a quiet room with secondhand chairs and a pot of tea. Sometimes it starts with one person refusing to stay silent, and another choosing to finally listen. And in that moment, Evelyn knew. The real victory wasn't winning a case or shaming a powerful man. It was lighting a spark that kept burning long after the cameras left. It was knowing that somewhere right now someone else was finding the courage to speak, and someone else was learning how to hear. That was enough. More than enough, because in the end, dignity isn't given. It's claimed. And once claimed, it can't be taken away. Not by a smirk, not by a title, not even by silence. And Evelyn? She'd made sure the silence was broken for good. Months had passed since the courtroom and the world kept turning, but not in the same old way. Something had shifted, quietly but surely, like a river changing its course after a storm. And at the heart of it all was a small room with a big purpose. The listening room. Every Saturday morning, without fail, Evelyn arrived early. She'd unlock the door, turn on the soft lamps, fill the kettle, and arrange the chairs in a loose circle. Not in rows like a classroom, but like friends gathering around a kitchen table. People came from all over now, not just from her neighborhood, but from across the city. Some walked in with their heads down, unsure if they belonged. Others carried notebooks, ready to share stories they'd kept hidden for years. One rainy Saturday, an older man in a worn delivery uniform stepped inside, dripping wet. He stood just inside the doorway, hat in hand, looking like he might bolt any second. Evelyn didn't rush him. She just poured a cup of tea and set it on a small table near him. "Take your time," she said gently. "No one's in a hurry here." He nodded, wiped his face with a handkerchief, and finally sat. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was rough but steady. "For 32 years I drove a delivery truck," he began. "Never missed a day. Not when my wife was sick, not when my boy was born, not even when my truck broke down in a snowstorm. But last year the company replaced us with machines. Robots that don't get tired, don't ask for raises, don't need health insurance. They handed me a check and a thank you, but nobody asked how I felt. Nobody asked what I knew, like which customers were lonely and needed someone to talk to, or which families were struggling but too proud to say so." He paused, looked around the room. "Today's the first time someone's looked me in the eye and said, 'Tell me your story.'" A woman in the back wiped her eyes. A young man leaned forward and said, "My uncle lost his job the same way. Maybe we could start a support group for folks pushed out by automation?" Evelyn smiled. That was the magic of this place. Stories didn't just end. They sparked new beginnings. Meanwhile, the judge had changed too, not in flashy ways, but in the small choices that matter most. He'd started arriving at court 15 minutes early just to greet the cleaning staff by name. He made sure interpreters were available before hearings, not after someone struggled. And when a young woman in a fast food uniform came to testify in a wage theft case, he didn't glance at his watch or sigh. He listened, really listened, and ruled in her favor the same day people noticed. Word spread. Other judges began asking him how he'd shifted his approach. He never took credit. "I just learned to see the person behind the role," he'd say. Turns out they've always been there. Back at the listening room, Evelyn never took center stage. She wasn't the speaker, she was the space maker. She'd hand someone a tissue when their voice cracked. She'd refill a coffee cup without being asked. She'd remember that Maria liked her tea with 2 sugars, or that Mr. Jenkins needed the chair with the extra cushion for his back. One Saturday, a teenager named Dev came in, skinny, nervous, eyes darting like he expected to be told to leave. He sat in the far corner, arms crossed, saying nothing. Week after week he came back, always silent. Evelyn never pressured him. She just saved him a seat and left a cookie on the table beside him. Then on the 8th Saturday he spoke. "I got kicked out of school," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "They said I was disruptive, but really I was hungry. My mom works nights. Sometimes there's no food. I couldn't focus. They didn't ask why. They just labeled me. The room stayed quiet. No one offered quick fixes. No one said it'll be okay. They just let his truth hang in the air, honored it by not rushing to cover it up." Afterward, a retired teacher approached him. "I run a free tutoring program after school," she said. "And we serve dinner. You're welcome anytime." Dev looked at Evelyn. She just nodded. "Go on," she said. "You deserve to be heard." and helped. That night, as she walked home under streetlights, Evelyn thought about how healing doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it's a warm room, a cup of tea, a seat saved just for you. News of the listening room even reached city leaders. A council member visited one Saturday, not with cameras or speeches, but just to listen. After hearing a single mother talk about choosing between rent and medicine, he quietly pushed for a new emergency assistance fund. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and through it all, Evelyn stayed the same, humble, steady, kind. She still took the bus. She still checked her grandson's homework. She still folded laundry with the same care she'd always had. But now, when she passed strangers on the street, they'd nod or smile, not because she was famous, but because she'd reminded them of something important, that everyone has a story worth hearing. One evening, the judge stopped by the room after hours. He found Evelyn sweeping the floor. "You've built something special here," he said. She leaned on the broom. "We all did. I just opened the door." He looked around, at the books, the chairs, the chalkboard where someone had written, "Your voice matters." "I used to think justice was about rules," he admitted. "Now I know it's about respect." Evelyn smiled. "Took you long enough." They both laughed, a quiet, honest laugh between two people who'd been on opposite sides of a room and now stood on the same ground. As the seasons changed, the listening room kept growing, not in size but in heart. People didn't come to fix each other. They came to witness each other. And in that witnessing, something powerful happened. Shame turned into strength. Isolation turned into connection. Silence turned into song. And Evelyn, she never asked for thanks. She never wanted a statue or a headline. All she ever wanted was for people like her, people who spent their lives in the background, to know they belonged in the foreground too. Because dignity isn't something you earn with money or power. It's something you carry inside, and sometimes all it takes is one person saying, "I see you," to help you remember it's there. And in that small room, week after week, that's exactly what happened. Over and over again, quietly, gently, and forever. Time has a way of smoothing out the sharp edges of a story, but it also deepens the roots. What started as a single moment in a courtroom, just one woman speaking up, had grown into something far bigger than anyone imagined. And yet in Evelyn's daily life it still felt simple. She woke up, made breakfast for her grandson, checked the weather, and took the same bus route she'd taken for years. But now, when she walked into the grocery store or waited at the bus stop, people didn't just see a quiet woman in a cardigan. They saw someone who'd shown them that courage doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs a voice, and the will to use it. One spring morning, a letter arrived, not in a plain envelope this time, but in official-looking paper with a city seal. It was an invitation. The mayor wanted to honor her at a community awards ceremony. Not for being a hero, the letter said, but for reminding us that dignity lives in everyday actions. Evelyn almost didn't go. She didn't like ceremonies. She didn't like speeches. But her grandson looked at her with wide eyes and said, "Grandma, you gotta go. So I can tell my class my grandma changed the world." So she went. She wore her best dress, the one with the tiny blue flowers, and sat in the front row, hands folded while the mayor spoke about truth, justice, and the power of ordinary people. When they called her name, the room stood. Not just clapped, stood. She walked slowly to the stage, heart pounding, and accepted a small plaque that read, "For listening, speaking, and leading by example." She didn't give a long speech. She just said, "I didn't do anything special. I just refused to let a lie stand when I knew the truth. And if that's enough to earn your respect, then I hope it reminds you that your voice matters too, no matter your job, your age, or your address." Afterward, people lined up to shake her hand. A young girl handed her a drawing of a woman holding a microphone made of broomsticks and books. A retired firefighter said, "My wife's a home health aide. People talk over her all the time. But after you spoke up, I started really listening. Thank you." Evelyn hugged the girl. She thanked the firefighter. And she walked out not feeling proud, but feeling connected. Back home, she placed the plaque on her bookshelf, right between her Bible and her grandson's first-grade report card. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. One honest choice can ripple farther than you ever dreamed. Meanwhile, the listening room had become a quiet landmark in the city. It wasn't flashy. There were no signs on the street, no social media page. People found it through word of mouth, through a neighbor, a teacher, a bus driver who said, "There's a place where you'll be heard." Every Saturday, new faces appeared. A nurse who'd worked through the pandemic without a break, a teenager who'd aged out of foster care, a veteran who'd carried silence for decades. They didn't come for advice. They came to be seen. And week after week, they left a little lighter, like they'd set down a burden they'd carried alone for too long. Evelyn never claimed to be a leader. She called herself a keeper of the space, but others saw her differently. A local college invited her to speak at their graduation, not as a guest of honor, but as someone who understood what real strength looks like. She agreed, but only if she could talk to the students beforehand. She visited campus a week early and sat with a group of first-generation college students in a small classroom. They were nervous, unsure if they belonged. "Let me tell you something," she said, leaning forward. "I never went to college. I cleaned houses, but I read every night. I asked questions. I listened more than I spoke. And you know what? Knowledge isn't locked behind a degree. It's in your curiosity, in your care, in your willingness to show up even when you're scared." One student asked, "But what if people don't take me seriously?" Evelyn smiled. "Then you keep showing up until they do. Not with anger. With consistency, with truth. Because respect isn't demanded. It's earned by how you carry yourself, day after day." On graduation day, she stood at the podium and told that same story, the courtroom, the recorder, the silence that followed. But she ended with this: "Don't wait for a big moment to do what's right. Do it in the small ones. Hold the door. Speak up when something's unfair. Listen when someone's hurting. That's how you change the world, not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet yeses." The students gave her a standing ovation, not because she was famous, but because she was real. Back in her neighborhood, life kept moving. Her grandson started middle school. The community garden she helped plant finally bloomed with tomatoes and sunflowers, and every Thursday she still met with adults learning to read, patiently sounding out words like hope, future, and enough. One afternoon, a woman in her reading group, soft-spoken, in her 50s, finished a whole paragraph out loud without stumbling. She looked up, tears in her eyes, and said, "I've hidden this my whole life. Thought I was stupid, but you never made me feel that way." Evelyn reached over and squeezed her hand. "You were never stupid. You were just waiting for someone to believe in you." That night, as she sat on her porch watching fireflies blink in the dusk, Evelyn thought about how healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a shared silence. Sometimes it's a cup of tea offered without asking why someone's crying. Sometimes it's just showing up week after week and saying, "I'm here. Tell me your story." She never sought fame. She never wanted money. All she ever wanted was for people like her, people who spent their lives serving others, to know they mattered just as much as anyone in a suit or on a stage. And now, in small ways all across the city, that message was taking root. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions begin not with a shout but with a whisper, and someone brave enough to listen. Years passed, but the ripples never stopped. What began in a courtroom with one woman's quiet courage had grown into something that couldn't be measured in headlines or awards. It lived in everyday moments, in changed hearts, in rooms where people finally felt safe to speak. Evelyn never called it a movement. She didn't like big words for simple truths. To her, it was just doing what's right one day at a time. She was older now. Her steps were slower, her hair fully silver, but her eyes still held that same steady light, the kind that sees people, not just their roles. She still lived in the same small house with the creaky porch swing and the garden out back that bloomed every summer with marigolds and mint. Her grandson, now in college studying social work, visited every weekend, bringing groceries and stories from his classes. He'd sit on the steps with her, sipping sweet tea, and say, "You know, Grandma, my professor used your story in class last week. Called it the power of ordinary integrity." She'd just smile and say, "Integrity ain't ordinary. It's rare, and it's always worth protecting." The listening room was still open every Saturday, though Evelyn didn't run it alone anymore. A group of volunteers, teachers, retirees, young activists kept it going. They painted the walls a soft yellow, added a shelf of donated books, and even started a little story jar where people could drop anonymous notes about things they weren't ready to say out loud. Every month, someone would read a few aloud, and the room would fall into that deep, respectful silence that only comes when truth is honored. The judge, now retired, came by often, not in a robe, just as a man who'd learned to listen. He helped fix the leaky faucet, shelved books, and sometimes just sat in the back with a cup of coffee, watching people connect. He never took credit for the room, but everyone knew his heart was in it. He'd told Evelyn once, "You didn't just change a case. You changed how I see the world." She'd patted his arm and said, "Then pass it on. That's how it grows." And it did grow, not in size, but in spirit. Other neighborhoods started their own listening circles. A church basement downtown hosted truth and tea nights. A community center in the next county opened a Quiet Voices program for elders and youth to share stories. None of them were exactly like Evelyn's room, but they all carried the same seed, that every person deserves to be heard, no matter who they are or what they do for a living. One spring morning, a letter arrived from a small town 3 hours away. It was from a high school teacher who'd read about the listening room in a magazine. She wrote that her students, many from working-class families, felt invisible. So she'd started a voice project where kids interviewed their parents, grandparents, and neighbors about their lives. One student recorded her grandmother talking about cleaning offices for 40 years and never being thanked by name. Another interviewed a bus driver who'd helped lost kids find their way home. The teacher ended the letter by saying, "You showed us that dignity isn't given, it's claimed. And now our whole school believes it." Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the shoebox under her bed, the same box that held her grandson's baby shoes, her mother's rosary, and the small key to the listening room. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled just a little, not from sadness, but from awe. She'd never imagined her one act of honesty would echo this far. That weekend, she went to the room one last time, not to lead, but to witness. She sat in her usual chair near the window, wrapped in a light shawl, and watched as a young woman spoke about being a home health aide and how people often talked about her like she wasn't in the room. When she finished, a retired mechanic stood and said, "My wife was a nurse's aide. She came home tired every night, but she never stopped caring. Thank you for reminding me to thank her while I still could." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. This was it. This was the real victory. Not the courtroom, not the headlines, but this. People seeing each other again. Really seeing. Later that year, the city renamed a small park near the community center in her honor. Not Evelyn Carter Park, she'd politely refused that, but the Listening Garden. It had benches shaped like open hands, a stone path with engraved words like "Hear," "Honor," and "Hold Space," and a little fountain that made soft, calming sounds. Kids played there after school. Elders sat in the shade, and every Saturday morning someone left a single marigold on the central bench, the flower Evelyn always grew. She never made a big speech at the dedication. She just stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, holding her grandson's arm, watching children laugh near the fountain. A reporter asked if she felt proud. She thought for a moment, then said, "Pride's a heavy thing. I feel grateful. Grateful that truth found a home. Grateful that people chose to listen." As the years went on, Evelyn slowed down. She stopped taking the bus and stayed closer to home. But her phone still rang often, sometimes from former strangers who'd found courage because of her, sometimes from young people asking for advice. She always answered, always listened. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple, she sat on her porch with a cup of chamomile tea. Her grandson sat beside her, quiet for once. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed silent that day?" he asked. She looked out at her garden, at the fireflies just beginning to blink in the dusk. "Every now and then," she said softly. "But then I remember, silence protects lies. And I couldn't live with that." He nodded. "I want to be like you." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "Then don't try to be like me. Just be honest, be kind, and never assume someone's story isn't worth hearing, especially if they've been told to stay quiet their whole life." He smiled. "I'll remember." And in that moment, Evelyn knew the work would go on. Not because of her, but because of the countless people who'd learned that dignity isn't earned by status. It's claimed by showing up, speaking truth and making space for others to do the same. She never sought fame. She never wanted monuments. All she ever wanted was for the quiet voices to be heard. And in the end, they were. Not just in courtrooms, but in kitchens, classrooms, bus stops, and gardens like this one. And as the stars came out, one by one, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes and smiled. The world was still far from perfect, but it was listening, and that was enough.